Welcome back. Yeah, as we mentioned, 50 years ago, Michael Harrington's classic book, The Other America, it really had a profound impact on the country. With his portrait of poverty in the U.S., it sparked a lot of reforms here. Miles touched on a few in the way that we deal with our nation's poor. A safety net of sorts was created, and it was something of national pride. But in the wake of the Great Recession, millions out of work, as you know, and inequality, without a doubt, is rising. Have and have-nots, the gap never been bigger. And many Americans live without the services that they need and make choices that I think many of us wouldn't imagine they have to make every single week, let alone month. There's still a lot to be done, and with that in mind, Demos, Public Policy Research and Advocacy Group here, held a national conference on American poverty in the 21st century. The conference, called 50 Years Since the Other America, it explored what low wages, low job growth, and budget cutting mean for Americans trying to make that next rung on the economic ladder. And here now, just a small snippet of the wide-ranging discussion they had on poverty and policy, and a discussion that ought to be happening more often, I believe, in our public sphere. Now, this panel, it was moderated by Bob Herbert, former New York Times columnist and current Distinguished Senior Fellow at Demos.
Fighting poverty is no longer high on most policymakers' agendas. And over the past several years, poverty and its associated ills have taken a ferocious toll on tens of millions of Americans, many of them very young. Harrington complained that in the prosperous early 1960s, the poor had slipped out of the consciousness of mainstream America, that they were increasingly isolated from their more fortunate fellow citizens. The poor were there all right, in enormous numbers, but the willful denial of the mainstream population kept them largely invisible.
The poorest age group are children, and they're very disproportionately in a single family home, single moms, and so very much the story of who is the poorest is about women and children. We have had this wave of low-wage jobs, so that now half the jobs in the country pay less than $34,000 a year, less than a quarter, less than the poverty line for a family of four. So we've gone from having the elderly as the poorest group, and now we have the prevalence of the poverty about children and women.
Public policy makes a huge difference in poverty rates and in the distribution of income. If it weren't for public policy and transfer programs, both the tax system and means-tested programs in the United States, our bottom 40% would have actually declined in income. But because of those transfer programs, if you include health care, every quintile has improved since 1979.
I do know that there's real concern in the African American community about the slippage. A Pew study pointed out that for those born since 1961, 45% of African Americans, children in the middle class, will slip into poverty. That's very disturbing, very disturbing. And it's also true that for children born into poverty, something like 47% of daughters and 35% of sons will stay there. Now, that's a huge problem. A huge problem. And when you think about the changing demographics and how many Black and Latino children are in poverty, if there are no pathways out, and those who manage to get out during a time when we were having a period of prosperity or slipping into poverty, we've got a mobility problem. There's a lack of a connection, that people don't see their next generation in those who are poor. And that absence of a psychological connection to the perceived poor, I think, creates an indifference. And that's a form of isolation, too.
We are spending $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion, on means-tested programs. It increases almost every year. Since 1980, we spend $3 per person more than we did in 1980. When we had Gramm-Rudman Hollings back in the 80s, and then when we had the debt ceiling agreement, most of the poverty programs were protected. So public policy, there's still a very strong commitment to low-income and poor people.
I think that there's not nearly a strong enough commitment to the interests of poor and low-income people in this country, which is why the ranks of the poor and low-income people, to me, are swelling like a wildfire. There's a presidential campaign going on out there, and all I ever hear about is the middle class. The Obama White House, a Democratic president, has a task force on the middle class, but we don't hear anything about the poor. That seems like indifference to me.
We are spending over $13,000 per poor person on means-tested programs. That's a huge increase over the years. That's a direct reflection of the commitment of the Congress and the U.S. public.
Currently, we have 2.8 million children living in households reporting less than $2 of income per person per day. If you consider food stamps as cash income, this amount is reduced by half.
We did something a couple of years ago. Actually, Democrats did it by themselves. They decided they were going to give the states money for emergency because TANF didn't have enough money and states were complaining they didn't have money. So they gave them $5 billion and they said, okay, Democrats did this. You can spend this money in any of three ways. You can have regular welfare like in the old days. You could make one-time payments for people whose car broke down or something to help them. Or you could subsidize jobs in either the public or private sector. And when I first heard this, I thought that what a great idea, but the states won't do it. They've never done it before. They could have done it before, but they didn't. Well, as Donna knows very well, they came up with 260,000 subsidized jobs. That's incredibly promising. Now, I don't know if that would work in the long run. I've never seen any cost-benefit figures, but we should have continued that.
Right.
Subsidizing jobs, I think this is it's a compromise politically because you're still trying to keep people in the public sector and working, not giving people something for nothing. We should have continued it and studied it more.
I am through thinking that we can have this conversation where one side says it's all about behavior and another side says it's all about policy. It's about both. And we both have to understand that policy and racism and the economy drive people into the actions that they take, and that if we recognize and respect people, respect that people really do want to do the right thing, want to care for their families, want to be able to be respected, want to be able to contribute, and create the circumstances that allows us all to live consistent with our values, we would be in a much better place.
We have to face up to that. Republicans have to face up that we will have to raise taxes, and Democrats have to face up we will have to cut programs, including social programs, because we can't go on like this. I mean, building up deficits, $1 trillion and more year after year after year, at some point is going to really, really hurt us.
We're a nation in which almost half the children are children of color. If those children do not do better than they are doing now, the future for the nation is not bright. We have to see this changing demographics as an extraordinary gift to the nation. It makes us young, it makes us vital, it makes us hungry, it makes us entrepreneurial, it makes us creative. All the things that we need to be able to pull out of this and do well. We need a narrative that embraces that inspires the American people to bring forward the wealth that they have and use it to build that future.
And that, again, just a portion of a really fascinating conversation and panel.